Bible, please open the passage on Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 52. Again, the scripture today is Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 52. I'm reading from ESV version of the Bible. You can just use whatever you wish, but please just follow along. And if you are able, but just keep that Bible passage open today, because I'll be specifically talking about that throughout the sermon. So, and again, as I'm reading, that's Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 52. And the title of this portion is called "The Boy Jesus in the Temple." Now, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and favor with God and men. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Over the past few weeks, the stores are filled with people, finishing up their Christmas shopping, and as well as to catch some great post-Christmas sales. And this is a time that when we witness some moms as well as dads corralling their very excited or very tired children in store, while they try to browse the holiday bargains. And at some time that we witness and hear some parents with the panic voices calling for their children who disappeared from their sight. It is scary to lose sight of your children and at the crowded places like a mall during the Christmas season. But can you imagine losing sight of your child in crowds, hundreds of thousands of people? And can you imagine if that happens in the big city, far away from home, like in the New York City, and without cell phone? And that is today's story from the Bible, Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 52. The Mary and Joseph lost sight of their 12-year-old son, Jesus, during the feast of Passover in Jerusalem, when thousands and possibly 1 million of people flocked into the city for the annual celebration. The chapter 2 of the book of Luke starts with the birth story of Jesus, which was foretold in the previous chapter. And that is a part of many people in the world, Christian or non-Christians, are familiar with. Shepherds and the angels and the baby Jesus in the manger, surrounded by the variety of animals, and the most humble but extraordinary event that took place in the human history. Nativity story was followed by a description of a ceremonial rite that Jesus had to go through, the circumcision on the 8th day, and the presentation of a newborn to the Lord by Mary and Joseph at the temple in Jerusalem according to the law of Moses. And Simeon and Anna, the prophets of the Lord, as they witnessed the dedication of the promised Messiah, they gave praises to God for the birth of Jesus, who would bring salvation to the world. All the exciting this birth story of Jesus. And if this is a regular biography, that there could be more description of a childhood, but the author Luke, the physician, skipped more than decades of Jesus' life and turned to today's passage when Jesus was 12 years old. And what's more interesting is that after today's passage, at the beginning of the chapter 3, the author skips another 18 years. And it continues to describe the ministry of the John the Baptist and then the temptation and the beginning of the Jesus ministry. So 12 years gap between the birth of Jesus Christ and today's passage, and 18 years gap between today's passage and the next stage of the Gospel of Luke. And here we cannot help but wonder, why did Luke inserted the story of Jesus when he was 12 years old? And I would like to tell you this morning that there is a very good reason why this story is a part of Luke's gospel narrative. As I studied this passage, I came to a conclusion that the story of finding the Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem is very significant in two distinct ways. The first, the story is a foreshadow to Jesus' future ministry, to his death and resurrection. And again, this story is a foreshadow to Jesus' future ministry, to his death and to his resurrection. And the second is I believe that this passage helps us to understand proper perspective on the relationship between God and us believers and seekers. Again, this passage helps us understand to have a proper understanding of the relationship between God and us. So this morning, I would like to ask ourselves a series of three questions that lead us to understand the significance of this passage. The first question is, how did Joseph and Mary not notice their son was gone for almost a day? How did they not know that? The second question is, when Mary and Joseph found Jesus sitting among the religious teachers and asked him many questions, why were they astonished? What was the reason they were astonished in that scene? And the third question is, why did Jesus say to Mary, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? Why did Jesus talk back to his mother in this way? So the first question is, how did Joseph and Mary not notice their son was gone for almost a day? This question is a general inquiry on the incident, that is, how did this happen? Can you imagine that you are missing your child for almost one whole day? Have you ever seen a movie called Home Alone? In which while his family was getting ready to go on the vacation to Paris for Christmas, the main character, Kevin, an 8-year-old, a troublemaker in the family, was left behind and became home alone. And during the flight to Paris, his mother finally realized that Kevin was not with them, and with great difficulties managed to go back to home and be reunited with her son. And this became the holiday classic, and you were able to watch this anytime during this holiday season, and I'm pretty sure that some of you have watched it. I still remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I went to a department store with my mother, and I had to go to a bathroom, so she told me to go to men's room. And she also told me to, when I'm done, to stay and wait at a bench that is right in front of the bathroom. So when I'm done, and then when I came out of the bathroom, I didn't see my mother there. So as I was told, I sat at the bench and waited for her. And a few minutes later, and she didn't show up. I started wondering where she went. So although I was hesitant of leaving the bench, I saw a store clerk at a nearby cashier. So I walked over there and asked the lady to make an announcement for me, because my mom was lost and missing in a department store. So the lady made an announcement for me, and a few minutes later, my mother showed up with an embarrassed look. And I said to her, well, you told me to wait at the bench, so I was waiting for you there. And as if I was saying that, well, you should have known that I was there. And I think the whole episode probably took place probably within the 5 to 10 minutes. But it must have been a traumatic experience for me that I still remember that incident 40 years after that. And Mary and Joseph didn't notice for one whole day. And it sounds impossible, and it would be even considered as a child neglect in today's society. However, the reason why they didn't realize that their son was missing was not as shocking as one would think in our modern society. The key to understand this question is the fact that they were traveling with other family members, and most likely with their relatives and friends, along with hundreds and thousands of other pilgrims who were on their way back to their hometown. So the two feasts of Passover and unleavened bread taking place at this time occupied a total of 7 days, and the pilgrims were required to stay at least 2 days during that time. So Joseph and Mary would have been traveling in a large caravan with other pilgrims, and a boy of his age might easily have been with his relatives or friends, so that they must have thought that Jesus was somewhere in the crowd, with the boys in his own age. So he was old enough not to sticking around with his parents all the time. Besides, Jesus must have been the responsible, obedient child, so Mary and Joseph gave him more credit and freedom during this long journey. While they might have been wondering why Jesus was not coming back to them, the Mary and Joseph must have been regretting that they did not think to check in with him time to time. Now they were frantically looking for their son, up and down in the tides of people going in and out of Jerusalem. And although age 12 is almost considered to be an adult in the ancient Jewish world, he still was a child, and we would think that he would miss his parents if he didn't see them for 3 days. So you would think his reaction toward his parents was nothing but ecstatic joy, like that at all the ecstatic joy, and we would imagine that this scene to be that both parents and the child, they're running toward each other and hugging and kissing with each other, and you can even see the tears from their eyes because of the joy of finding each other. But to our surprise, as well as to Joseph and Mary, the reunion scene was not like that at all, because Jesus was in deep philosophical discussion with the city's highly regarded teachers, and didn't seem to show any concern over the fact that he hadn't been seeing his parents for the past 3 years. And this brings us to the next question. So when Mary and Joseph found Jesus sitting among the religious teachers and asking many questions, why were they so astonished? Why were they so astonished? Were they astonished because Jesus didn't seem to be so happy to be found by his parents? Or were they astonished by the fact that he was sitting among the wise and elderly teachers and having a discussion as if he was one of them? And to answer this question, we need to examine this passage a little grammatically. Note that the passage says that the parents saw him rather than they saw this. In other words, that they were not astonished because of what's happening, the scenery of what they're seeing, but what they're seeing is Jesus himself. They were astonished at the Jesus himself. But was it because of Jesus who saw them that didn't seem to be ecstatic about finally being found by his parents after 3 days of frantic search? What is very interesting, this passage is the original Greek word used for to astonished, was almost exclusively used to describe the people's amazement at Jesus' teachings and the miracles. In other words, the word astonished were used almost always at Jesus' teaching and how awesome and wonderful and divine that was. In other words, although it is reasonable to assume that Joseph and Mary were so glad to see their son and were at the same time not happy at all for what he had done to them, as we can clearly see from what Mary said in the next passage, but their astonishment was most likely at what Jesus was doing with the teachers of the law. The passage says in the verse 46 and 47 that Jesus sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So here that Jesus was not just asking them simple questions with simple answers. The word asking them question has a very strong implication that this was a deep philosophical debate. You know, sometimes when we ask the children the question, the answer is very simple. So who died on the cross? The Jesus. So who do you have in your heart? The Jesus. Who's in heaven? God. We're not talking about these simple questions. The Jesus, amongst the teachers, they were talking very deep, philosophical, theological questions at the age of 12 years old. Then this was the first scene in the Gospel of Luke which that Jesus revealed his divine teachings, which would make many people be astonished throughout his ministry. The Mary, while she was relieved that her son was alive and well, she, as any other mother would do, got upset. Son, how could you do this to us? You know, what is perplexing here is how Jesus, an obedient, responsible son, replies to his mother, and this leads to the next question. Why did Jesus say to Mary, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Now, what was the tone of conversation between Jesus and Mary when Mary reprimanded Jesus of his mistreatment of his parents and his response to her? Was he confrontational? Was Jesus annoyed by his parents? Or was he sincerely wondering why his parents didn't know where he was? You know, some people might think here that Jesus is harshly reprimanding back at his parents because of their ignorance regarding his destiny. Now, this may sound like the modern-day sitcom scene in which a know-it-all child reprimands his parents for their ignorance to pull some laughs from the audience. But obviously, the major difference between Jesus and this know-it-all child in sitcom is their takes on the Ten Commandments. That is to say that Jesus fully understands the importance of honoring his mother and father, and disregarding this commandment would be a sin. But here, while Jesus recognizes his duty as a child to be obedient to his parents, he also understands that following his path, which is set by God the Father, exceeds his earthly duty to his parents. So when Jesus said to Mary, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" That Jesus was not at all disrespecting his mother, but gently reminding Mary of God's purpose in him. The purpose that was revealed a long time ago to Mary when she was conceived by the Holy Spirit. And that is to say, the real purpose of this boy Jesus was to astonish many people with his teachings, and he needed to be with God in his temple, where Jesus would be seated at the right hand of the Heavenly Father. We tend to read this story of young boy Jesus with an idea that the purpose of this passage is to simply show how smart the Jesus was at his early age. However, a careful reading of this passage reveals to us more than that. And just as Mary and Joseph was looking for a young boy Jesus who had disappeared from them, but found on the third day, 20 years later, that Jesus died on the cross and was taken away from his parents as well as the disciples, but on the third day, people found Jesus again after his resurrection. Therefore, a foreshadow of what was, this passage is a foreshadow of what was going to happen in the life of Jesus. And while today's story is a foreshadow of Jesus' future ministry, the passage also helps us to understand proper perspective on the relationship between God and us, the believers. And the key to understand this proper perspective, I believe, is to understand the meaning of the word searching, which we can see in the verses 48 and 49. The word searching in the original language, according to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, when used in a religious setting, this word first denotes the seeking of what is lost, which is undertaken by the Son of Man with a view of saving it. Like the story that we can, this concept can be found in a story such as the lost sheep and the lost coin. And this is a very appropriate word for today's story, in which Jesus' parents were searching for their lost son. But this same word, according to the Theological Dictionary, also denotes this is the people's general philosophical search or quest for wisdom and truth. So his parents' intention was to look for Jesus with a view of saving him who was lost, as we see in the first definition. But what Jesus said to his parents reveals that he was not the one who was lost and needed to be rescued. That is the reason why Jesus asked Mary, "Why were you searching for me?" He asked this question because, on contrary to what Mary and Joseph thought, Jesus was not lost, and therefore did not need to be searched and rescued. And then Jesus said to Mary, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" And this suggests that Jesus not only talking about his own physical presence at the temple of God, but also pointing to his own purpose in the plan of God, that he needed to be with God in his temple. That is to say that while Mary used the word searching, as in looking for a child who was lost, that Jesus answered her in the second definition as in looking for the true purpose of Jesus in God's plan of salvation. In other words, if you're looking for truth, if you're looking for the true purpose that God have given to me, you should have known that I should have been in my Father's house here at the temple. If you were searching for me. But actually, that Jesus was meaning to say that you were looking for the truth, and the truth can be found in me here in the God's house. So what does this help us to understand the proper perspective on our relationship with God? And here is the very simple answer. God is sovereign. God does not need our help. God is not lost, and God is not dead. And he does not need to be found. He's always there. He's always here. Even with our sincerest intention, we don't need to search out for God so that we can bring him back and he has a safe place in our society. And he doesn't need to be reformed so that he will have a proper place in our life. He doesn't need to be reinvented. He doesn't need to be given a new definition so that we can understand him. He can be found in the person of Jesus Christ. And we don't need to be angry at or reprimand God when we feel like he disappeared from our midst while we frantically search for an answer to our toils and struggles. Because God can be always found in Jesus Christ, who carries the banner of man as well as God, and who is the true purpose of God among us, who died and has risen and forever reigns over us. So the story of the boy Jesus is a foreshadow of his future ministry. And as the Mary and the Joseph was looking for a young boy, Jesus, who had disappeared from them, but found on the third day, 20 years later, Jesus died on the cross and was taken away again from his parents as well as disciples. But on the third day, people found Jesus again after his resurrection. And he was seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty in his heavenly temple. And also this story reminds us of God's sovereignty in Jesus Christ. God is not a lost child who needs to be rescued. It is actually us who were lost, but now are found in Jesus Christ, who sits on the throne of God forever and ever.